Hi, today's September 8th, 2024. I'm honored to have with me Tracy Thurman, who's a writer at brownstone.org and has her own Substack and X. We'll get to those in a second. Tracy is an expert, I think, on the war on food. You wouldn't think there would be one. I mean, maybe toddlers sort of have a war on their own food and splatter it about. But I guess, we are having a war on food. Why? And what is it? And how does it affect us all? Because most people I know actually consume food. So it's a pretty inclusive topic. So it's preoccupying. Most of your Instagram is about food. Tracy, what should we be worried about, and why are we even having this type of war on something we all need?
Well, that's such a great question. And again, why are we having a war on food when it is something we all need? Is really I've never heard it boiled down so succinctly. So we all want a healthy food supply. At least, those of us who are, the peasants in this society do. We'd like to have that for all of us. And most of us would never have dreamed 10 years ago that there would be a push to demonize our farmers, the people who produce the food for us. And yet that's where we are now as a society. When we look at what's happening in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, in many countries in Europe, many people have seen the footage of farmers coming out en masse and protesting. Many people may be familiar with the overthrow of the government in Sri Lanka by the farmers there when they were told they had to go organic overnight, in which any organic farmer will tell you is an impossibility to do that, let alone on a countrywide level. And it happened at the same time they were undergoing an acute diesel shortage. So facing a massive famine, the people rioted, stormed the presidential palace, and overthrew their government. But farmers all over the world are being persecuted, prosecuted, and shut down. And it's very confusing to the rest of us normal people why this would be happening when these are the people we depend on more than almost anyone else. Like, we can live without gender studies majors, we can't live without farmers. So yeah, why is this happening? And you really have to start to dig into who are the people behind this push to persecute our farmers, and what is their agenda on an individual and organizational basis? Where are they going with this? And so that was really the basis of the series that I wrote for Brownstone and for Children's Health Defense, which you can find on my Substack.
Yeah. I'd like to get to those articles, put them up for people, and I'd like to give you a chance to expand on those topics. I had just a few days ago, I had on Professor David Hughes, who is a Brownstone fellow, and I'm sure we'll all get to chat maybe between us at some point through Brownstone. But he steered me to a chart created by Ian Davis, and I'm going to put that up if I get a second while you're talking. And coincidentally, there's always this concept of who's at war with us, like real war, not just war on drugs, war on food, war on this, war on COVID, war on viruses, but an actual war. I'm not deeply conspiratorial, but I wonder, about kind of the global jihad, it's kind of taking over seemingly pieces of Europe bit by bit. I worry about the Chinese, and I worry about communism. I worry about a bunch of things taking us over at various points. And somebody on my Facebook said, what about the UN? I think you're kind of undervaluing kind of this global takeover of our institutions. And some of these things seem to be kind of part of this globalist thing. So here we have another threat. It's, and the people who kind of demonize, nationalism, are looking for some type of, supranationalism, one world. And this kind of segues into your talking about One Health agenda, and I'll let you kind of get to those things. And so I'm going to remove myself from the scene briefly and let you expound on any of those topics you feel like discussing. And I'll put up that chart I was mentioning when I get a chance.
Sure.
So yeah. So as a brief question, I guess would be, what is One Health, and how does this play into some of the nefarious, I'll use that word, I'll go there, the nefarious forces which are somehow threatening our food? And what's the underlying principle? I mean, is it zero population growth? Is it, reducing the number of people on the planet for some kind of like quasi-utopian misguided goal?
So that's, again, great question. And it can be difficult to find a unified definition of One Health. Many places that are using it don't actually fully define it. But the definition that is most informative, and one of the most widely used one, actually comes from a paper by The Lancet, and it was their expert panel on that put together this definition, and they came up with it as being equity in decision making on health issues between plants, animals, the environment, and humans. And this might not on the surface sound like a big deal, but if you think about it for a minute, that means that when decisions are being made about your personal health, those decisions are being based on what is good for not just you, but what your doctor or hospital or even a public health agency thinks is good for the planet and is good for animals. And so think about this for a second. Many of us do far better on a diet that has a large amount of animal-based protein in it. I'm one of those people. I eat basically an only animal-based diet because I've had a ton of health issues in my life, and this is what has allowed me to become far healthier than I used to be. But if the decision over what's good for my health is being based on what a public health agency believes is good for the planet, well, we already know what they have to say about what's good for, that cows are bad for the planet. So am I going to have to remove beef from my diet? Are you going to have to remove eggs from your diet? And if you think this sounds conspiratorial or crazy, you need to go look at the agenda of C40 Cities. So C40 Cities is based on a research project that was done by the Arup Group, a paper that they wrote that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And the idea behind C40 Cities is a massive reduction in carbon emissions, to save the planet. And it's not a fringe concept at all. Cities throughout the world have signed on to this agenda. It's the same group, by the way, behind 15-minute cities. And some of the groups that have signed on the cities that have signed on include Philadelphia, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, Phoenix, Austin, Texas, Washington, D.C., I believe San Francisco, Boston. You can look at the list, but you're getting the idea. It's almost every major city in the United States has already signed on to this project. And if you look at the C40 Cities website, they state they have an ambitious goal for by the year 2030 that the average citizen will only be able to buy 3 new items of clothing every year, that they will not own cars, that they would be allowed only 1 short-haul flight every 3 years, and that your intake of red meat would be limited to 30 calories per day. And again, wow. I'm reminding you that most of the major cities in the US have already signed on to the C40 Cities plan. And so New York City is one of the ones that has been most public. The purchasing habits of food of their residents are already being tracked. American Express is an open partner in this project and is turning that data over to the city. And they stated that their goal is to cut the carbon output of foods eaten in the city by significantly by 2030. And the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, said that these emissions are majority coming from fish, eggs, dairy, and meat. So if they're planning to cut the majority of the carbon, and that these are the foods that it's coming from, what does that leave you with? It basically leaves you with plant-based foods only.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. I mean, it's not really mathematical because one of the top carbon producers is yourself. Carbon dioxide. I mean, you're living and breathing, and at the same time, at New York City, I don't know if it still is a sanctuary city. You're letting in tens, if not ultimately hundreds of thousands of people in, and guess what? They're going to want to do every day. They're going to want to eat, and some of these things are so incredibly short-sighted. I don't want to monopolize this point, but there was probably read this 10 or 15 years ago that, basically the first world countries were going to have to, stop farming because of inefficiency and CO2 production and so forth from the tractors and whatnot. And the converse was, which was not mentioned, was the fact that farmers in say, we'll call it the third world, were using donkeys and mules and oxen and whatnot to do their farming. And those guys don't have any on-off switch. So they're continual CO2 producers, and they're not really measured or monitored on the basis of using fossil fuels, but they're using fuel nonetheless. And so a John Deere is much more efficient than a deer. Because whatever fuel it uses, it's using just in the production of doing its tractoring, agrarian tasks and whatnot. And an actual deer, I'm not using deer, but aside for the pun, but an actual oxen is going to be on all the time. And whether he's spends like 10% of his life doing actual farm work, the rest of it he's going to be eating and sleeping and hanging around and consuming. So the efficiency is much, much higher for a John Deere than an actual deer, because again, they have on-off switches and they're only doing that one task when they're doing that task. So it was always fatuous and simple-minded to look at kind of the CO2 emissions based on fossil fuels in kind of first world farming in the Netherlands, the United States, and whatnot, and not looking at the converse. It's always this and never that. People don't seem to be able to compare things outside the box. They're going to be able to look at fossil fuels in Pakistan, fossil fuels in the U.S., and say, oh, we use more per capita, to produce food. But on the converse, clearly one is more efficient than the other. And it's a Luddite. It's worse than Luddite, because I think the Luddites want to just be left alone. But this is kind of like a perverse quasi-Malthusian. The Malthus apparently was wrong. We were able to have more people on the planet, and we're able to do things much more efficiently. And everyone's kind of like all sad about this, that, oh my God, we're successful, and we have to kind of kneecap ourselves so we become unsuccessful to prove their original theories, because the reality hasn't aligned with their theories. Anyway, sorry for that, screed there, but I'm wondering, what are these motivations, and who are the players we have to watch out for, and how does all this One Health kind of stuff get bundled in? And why do you think they chose that name? And what, it seems like a kind of bait and switch. They want everything to be under health, so they can manipulate you. It seems always the answer is like they want to control you. Anyway, so there may or may not be a question there. Do you want to address that?
Sure. So I would say the reason that everything's being rolled under health is that if you can get everything under biosecurity, what doesn't fall under biosecurity? And if you can get everything under One Health, what won't fall under that? It's in the same way that the Patriot Act was sort of Operation 1.0 in control of the population. Biosecurity is Operation 2.0, because first it was the terrorists on the outside that were the issue. But in this format, we are all a danger. And if you want to understand that better, look no further than COVID. COVID was a biosecurity psyop in my mind. Because if any one of us can be carrying the problem, we are all the enemy. And we all deserve to be treated with suspicion and controlled. And so biosecurity is a very pernicious idea. And it is the next paradigm for control. One Health plays into this perfectly. So if you think of One Health as being this overarching paradigm where health encompasses everything that impacts the health of the individual, the health of the planet, and the health of the animals and the environment. If all of those are under the same paradigm, then what decision in your life is not a healthcare decision at that time? Where you go, what you buy, those are healthcare decisions now. Because
I think you have it exactly right. I spent a couple of years in my life where all the decisions surrounding my life were made by other people. It wasn't in prison, and it's not specific, strictly speaking, marriage, although there's some aspects. But when I was an infant, I had no say in my food choices. I think I barely remember. I had no choice in where I was going to go. I had no choice in what I wore. And that's kind of the good kind of prison, because you're not really mentally capable, and somebody's caring for you, and they want good from you. They want good of you, and they want to produce for you, and they're working really hard behind the scenes. You have no idea, in order to get those things to keep you alive, and you're the kind of the light. Maybe it's all downhill from year one. You're the center of the world and focus of attention. I was listening to a comedian talk on this topic, and you can do whatever you want and so forth. Anyway, but so I didn't really complain at that point about having all my choices made for me. But it seems to me kind of an infantilization of humanity really obviously a move away from individual liberty and self-determination. And this seems to be always like a threat. I'm going to just put up the kind of this what Professor Hughes had as his graph of some of these actors and how they align. I maybe so this was on a previous podcast, but this is kind of again, not a conspiracy theorist here, but it seems that a lot of these things get aligned together. This is kind of the up in the upper part here, the global public-private partnership, WEF, Council for Foreign Relations, that's the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, Chatham House, Rockefellers, and so on. The Rockefellers, people don't really realize, had a lot to do with the founding of the WHO itself. And this WHO, again, people may or may not know, is part of the United Nations. And
by the way, and the Rockefellers had a huge amount to do with the founding of the United Nations too.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much the Rockefellers per se are doing, because I think I kind of worry more about the Soroses these days. But that being said, there just seem to be
in the food space. The Rockefellers are very active.
Really?
Yes. Look at the Reset the Table agenda. It was launched around the same time as the Great Reset. It's a partner to it, and it's a Rockefeller Foundation policy on, resetting the table and transforming the food supply. And by the way, you're going to hear, if you're in this space, you will see over and over and over again the words transform the food supply, transform the food supply, transform the food supply.
All right.
Policy document after policy document, NGO after NGO, the UN, the FAO. The EU FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, the USDA, all of these are making references to a total transformation of the food supply. And we need to listen to those words very carefully.
So what is the transformation of the food supply? I'm going to get back to your kind of brownstone page in your Substack so people can see that. I might put them up in the background. I hope it's not too distracting. Transform it into what? I mean, eat bugs? I mean, what are we getting at here? And what's the supposed benefit to humanity if they're really interested in kind of reducing humanity, it seems, and making us eat sludge or whatever they think is the right food, or it seems like it's kind of a mixed message, because you bring up that they're going to want to have like vaccines in the food, and so they want to make us healthy, they want us to keep us alive, they want to kill us. I mean, what's the actual? If we could put on their hats and presume them to be, having positive thoughts about something. Because, I mean, I think even your dictators, they have an idea that they have a vision, and they think when they go to bed at night, they're doing good for the world by doing X, Y, and Z. We can disagree with their premises and whatnot. So if you could kind of role play and be, I don't know, whichever actor or agency, whatever, what is it they want to accomplish by this?
I believe the goal is a complete control of the food supply, a completely surveilled food supply, and not to be made up of organic, healthy foods locally grown by independent farmers. That would be available only to the most wealthy among us. But instead, a heavily processed diet, much as the direction we've been moving in as a society for a few decades now, but a heavily processed diet of what I would consider to be fake foods. And I don't say that unadvisedly. All you have to know how they're planning to transform the food supply is to look at the projects that they are funding that are in the pipeline. So the US government is funding a project through DARPA, the Department of Advanced Research Projects for the US military. And they are funding the development of plastic-based protein, where they take military waste plastics, feed them to bacteria to create protein powders that can be fed to humans. I mean, it sounds delicious to me. I don't know about you. There also is a tremendous amount of money going into the insect-based food development. And the EU, for instance, has their novel food program, where they are any food that was not considered to be human food before 2001 can now qualify as a novel food and be approved. And insects are on that list. They've approved, it's either 4 or 8 insect species for consumption in the EU. And their policy statement that goes along with this is very interesting. They talk about the increased demand for protein among the middle classes as being a problem, and how insects are key to that solution. Of course, this is a problem that, in a sense, they are causing themselves because they are shutting down the healthy, true protein supply, such as beef, such as milk, such as eggs. And to understand that how they're shutting those down, look no further than the Netherlands, where they are actively seizing farms to shut down. So many countries are putting into place carbon caps and carbon reduction schemes. It's usually about 30% reduction scheme aimed for by 2030, or sometimes it's 2027. So in Ireland, this has already been declared that this is going to lead to the culling, i.e., the killing of hundreds of thousands of dairy cows to meet these climate goals. In Canada, they're skipping calling it a nitrogen reduction, and they're going straight to calling it what it is, which is a fertilizer reduction. And so requiring a reduction in fertilizer use of 30%. That includes, organic manure being used on organic farms. And then in the Netherlands, they skip right over that, and they just go straight to a reduction in livestock. So all the pretense is gone. We're just reducing livestock, and they've stated that they intend to seize 3,000 farms and shut them down entirely. Now, there has been progress on this in the Netherlands by the farmers' movement. And so the seizure and shutdown of farms may be at least delayed. But to look at how they're intending to transform the food supply, again, look at what they are removing from the food supply and look at what they are funding and adding. And what they are funding and adding is heavily processed fake meats that are made in a lab and have to be grown out of what are essentially cancerous cells, right? Normal cells of an animal do not grow indefinitely. You need cells that grow indefinitely. What grows indefinitely? Tumor cells and some fetal cells as well. So they take that and they put it in a dish, but in order to get only that to grow, they have to add huge amounts of antibiotics and antifungals. And so this is expensive. It's heavily contaminated with pharmaceuticals. And it is grown from what are essentially cancerous eternal cell lines. And so they're putting a ton of money into the development of that. There's also the fake meats that are made from plant-based materials, and those are heavily contaminated with glyphosate and hexane and other toxins. And they're made out of genetically modified and essentially untested ingredients too, like the soy-based heme that is added to Bill Gates's Beyond Meat burgers, that is designed to make it look like the fake meat is bleeding. And this was not thoroughly tested, and yet was added to the school lunch supply in the United States. So
I kind of I'm amazed by all this stuff, and we could for real in-depth discussion, I think people should go to your Substack, and I'll put that up in a second. But from my perspective, it seems like I know they want to do a lot of things, and they want to have power to do a lot of things. And you're probably too young to remember the movie Bananas by Woody Allen, but basically it's kind of a Cuba-like takeover of Latin American country. And when the revolutionary gets in charge, it turns out he's crazy. He just wants people to do things for the sake of doing them. And so he makes all these kind of edicts, and one of those is that everyone has to change their underwear every day, and because people are going to have a hard time checking, they're going to have to wear their underwear on the outside. And he's got a whole bunch of these kind of silliness things, and part of it, again, kind of like 1984, the essence of 2 + 2 = 5 is not that 2 + 2 = 5, but to get somebody to break down and have to go and contravene their own sensibilities and say that thing as obeisance, as a bowing to the state. So aside from mere power hungry, kind of Dr. Evil ish, villainhood, I don't see that they see themselves as villains. But if you could articulate, again, kind of to my previous question, what is it they really, really, really want? What is it they want? Do they just want to tinker with stuff and be in charge? Fine. But what's their vision here? I mean, they want to cut down this. They want to replace this. It seems like they want to limit people and kind of make food more efficient. Maybe. I mean, what's the charitable aspect of what they want to do if they were here to phrase it?
They would probably tell you that their goal is to prevent climate change and prevent the massive famine from overpopulation. I believe that's what they would tell you, because if you listen to most interviews with Bill Gates, that's where he goes with it. I do not believe that is the agenda. I do not believe, by their fruits you will know them. And you
Funny
can
way to
also
say
look
that.
at their, yeah. And if you look at the actions they take, if you truly cared about lowering the amount of carbon, you would plant trees. You would increase the green space, but it doesn't even have to be green space that's unharvested. You could, it could be foodstuff green space too. You can have food forests. There is tremendous amount of data on the amount of carbon that is removed, but Bill Gates has come out and said, no, if when someone asked him about why don't we just plant more trees, he said, look, are we the science people or are we the idiots? That's his view of a solution along those lines. His solutions always involve genetic modification, further control, and pharmaceuticals. Always. They're never, his idea is never, look, let's enable small farmers to simply do what they do best, especially, the small organic farmers, regenerative farmers. Let's get out of their way. Let's let them run their own experiments, see what
Hmm.
they can develop on their own. It's this very technocratic top-down regime. So what do I think is going on? I think we have a class of technocratically minded, power-hungry individuals. Many of these are generationally so. Like this, they aren't the first one in their family to feel this way, let's say. And I encourage anybody to look back at the history of the agricultural policies and other policies of the Rockefeller family, for instance, over the past 100 years. The current generation of that family is not the first. And the same with these organizations, right? They think in terms of decades and generations. They do not think in 4-year election cycles as the rest of us tend to do. And so I think that there is a technocratic agenda for total control of the of the planet, right? Money is no longer an object to them. Control is. And many of these people view the rest of us humans, the plebe class, as essentially cattle to be managed. And they will more or less say so as well. So if the rest of us are essentially cattle to be managed, you got to keep the population of your farm at a certain level. You don't want it growing out of control. You want them in a very specific area. You don't want them roaming free, and you want management. And I think they want animal-style management of the human population. This is why they have no use for democracy.
Yeah, and it's an amazing thing. All the creativity. I mean, the technocratic part. The first part is techno. In order to get good technology, you actually need ideas to bubble up from people with a reasonable amount of liberty. I was involved in the kind of innovation sphere. I was actually at a place called the Cambridge Innovation Center, and maybe that's optimistic, but a lot of people come from all over the world, and they want the innovation culture that we have or / had to a point. Whether we are still, the most creative place on the planet, I don't know. I personally there's been a freezing of certain amount of like percolation of ideas. But people come from China, which has more people, and they have smart people. They're good at math and good at a lot of things. They kind of nurture the tools for technology, but they're not producing the ideas. And so there was a huge number of people from China and other places coming to, in this case, Cambridge, kind of the milieu of MIT and Harvard to a lesser extent, to get these ideas that can percolate. So you need it's kind of like food in a way. You need to germinate ideas. You need to germinate food, and the word of germinate has germs in it. So there's going to be a little bit of messiness involved. It's not always a clean process, and there are failures and whatnot. But the oddity is that, they have all these grandiose, again, kind of like, Dr. Evil ideas about how to, take over the world, or Pinky in the Brain. Maybe every episode they want to take over the brain wants to take over the world. But oddly enough, by stifling people and corralling them, like cattle and whatnot, you're not going to get ideas percolating. You're going to get a fixation and a basically kind of a Stasi East German work camp atmosphere. And it's so short-sighted, aside from annoying and stupid. And again, it is kind of this weird caricature. I mean, again, I grew up on comic books and whatnot. You have very well-defined evil doers like Dr. Evil. Obviously, it was cartoonish. the Joker, the Riddler, the this and that, and you can kind of identify them. But oddly enough, the seems like the some nefarious characters now are of the elites. I mean, you have a good quote by Prince Philip. Maybe you can harvest that for us. And John Kerry, we know, was asked about all the mega carbon tons or whatever that he's using. Well, it's more important for him. He has to be these places, so he's not going to restrict himself to a 15-minute city, like diet of a one flight, for 10 minutes, whatever. But what do we name these guys? I mean, it's just kind of a treason of the elites, it seems, against the people. I mean, there used to be lèse-majesté, and this idea that you had a role in the upper levels of society, and you had kind of I guess it was noblesse oblige. I might have my quotes wrong, but noblesse oblige is that you have the sense of being nobility, that you have an obligation to those under you. You have more, and that seems such a quaint notion now, and it seems actual kind of genuine derision and hatred from our betters. Maybe again, if you can toss out the Prince Philip one and his offspring, Prince Charles, I don't think it's really fallen far from that tree.
No. So it was a 1989 interview where Prince Philip was asked, if you were ever, if you were to be reincarnated, what would you want to be reincarnated as? And he said he'd like to be reincarnated as a virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation. And that does give you a window into how many of these people think. He has also been on record as saying other very disturbing things about management of the world's population, and how occasionally there's a need for culling. And so these people do, like I said, view the rest of us as essentially cattle to be managed. And unless we understand that, we will have a very difficult time understanding and predicting their actions. But if we do know it, their actions start to make a lot of sense. So, to me, the best name for them is technocrat.
Yeah.
I would encourage people to go and read the work of Patrick Wood on technocracy, Rising. It's excellent, excellent research, and this is not a new agenda. It goes back to the 1930s. At the time, it sounded crackpot because they didn't have the technology to implement it. But the whole idea of us living under a system of energy credits, where your behavior would dictate the number of energy credits that you got. And if that's starting to sound a lot like our world today, then congratulations, you're paying attention.
Right.
But we are moving very rapidly toward a system of energy credits under a carbon system and a social a social credit score system.
Yeah.
And if you look at those combined with central bank digital currencies, we're heading in a very dark direction very quickly.
Yeah, no, I agree with you in that. I personally think that the reason that MAGA, Make America Great Again, is seen as, and MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, now kind of conjoined, is that it threatens this, I think, again, short-sighted, perverse, power-hungry, technocratic urge. Donald Trump, his only, he's got many flaws. I mean, we are all flawed individuals, but he was able to kind of see through the Paris Accords and see through the JCPOA, the Iran deal, as it were, and see through a lot of the frauds that had been perpetrated by the abominations and whatnot. And he fell for the technocrat illusion. I've written for Brownstone a number of different articles, but the most recent one is Dr. Fauci's DNA of Caring, or it's called Fauci's DNA of Caring. And he, again, I always try to get in people's own minds about this kind of thing. And it's not that hard with him because he's a talker, more than myself probably. And on his book tour, he announces, says, I always had this DNA of caring. His dad was a pharmacist, and he just can't get away. He's such a caring person, and he's denied initiating lockdowns at the same time that he brought about lockdowns. But clearly, Trump was, I think, cruising to victory in 2020. I mean, anything could have happened, but I think he was favored in the polls and think the economy was great. And this was a takedown. This was a technocratic, sleight of hand to misrepresent things as a Chinese bioweapon, when clearly, from the Diamond Princess alone, it was obvious that it was not. Even if it was a Chinese bioweapon, it wasn't a lethal one. And you know, and that was probably his fatal flaw, that he wasn't really willing to research the matter himself. But again, it's tough because he can't be everything. He can be good at his version of politics, and you can't necessarily be a bio statistician / scientist, whatever. And he listened to the wrong people, and the wrong people have this technocratic image. And I think that a lot of COVID stuff, and I don't, the part of that article is that, this was kind of a Trojan horse, COVID was, for mRNA technology, which had never passed phase 1 trials. And this was a way of basically trotting it out on the whole population all at once. I mean, of the world, essentially. And side effects be damned. And this kind of like real disdain for people is, again, the opposite of noblesse oblige, and is the opposite of DNA of caring. Unless the only DNA of caring is, some mRNA that you think is going to give people your own mindset, which is not caring at all.
Right.
So the question would be, kind of to segue to the mRNA part, you're talking about food as pharmacology in a sense. I'm a little bit skeptical on that, because I think, the gut is pretty good at breaking down proteins and whatnot. What is out there? What's being attempted at the very least, and what are our worries about, food being kind of I guess a Trojan horse, essentially. I mean, which is kind of almost a virus term. And one last point about the Prince Philip virus is, this is a guy who wants to be a virus, who actually currently is a parasite. I mean, during his lifetime. I mean, this is a guy who produces Zippo, aside from being a figurehead and living on huge estates. We were in England in January. Windsor Castle is just an amazing place. But it's really not a family home. It's a home for maybe, if they really want to be a sanctuary city, they could probably take about 5,000 or 10,000 people and put them there.
Right.
But so it's kind of an odd thing that, there's an old expression that an attorney, I don't know if you are an attorney, so don't take this personally. My dad was a lawyer. I love lawyers. But there's an old sardonic definition, which is an attorney is a parasite who does not yet realize he is such, because nobody has yet paid him to do so. But in this case, Prince Philip, living parasitically, sees himself as somehow to be reincarnated. Maybe he is currently, in the case of King Charles, as that virus that takes down humanity. So to get to my previous question, is there kind of the pharmacologizing, if that's a word, of food?
Yes. So there's been a big to do over the last year or so of whether or not there are mRNA vaccines in our food supply. And, I would say that's not really the right question to ask. I do recommend everybody ask what vaccines are being given to their food. There are hundreds of veterinary vaccines being given to food. Actually, the most vaccinated part of your food supply is farmed fish. And there are already DNA vaccines being given to fish. So, and there are RNA vaccines in the being given to pork. So those are on the Sequivity platform made by Merck. There are currently no mRNA vaccines in our beef. I think it's the University of Iowa is doing a study right now trying to develop a continuous release mRNA patch that would be embedded in cows, so releasing a continuous stream of mRNA, so-called vaccine. And that does bring up questions, because if those are dairy cows, that the mRNA would cross into the milk, because we know it did, enter babies through breast milk after their mothers were vaccinated during the COVID pandemic. And so that's the fact that there were infants who were consuming the milk of their mothers after being vaccinated during the COVID pandemic, who experienced health effects, does give me pause for concern here, because I would have also made the assumption that it would be most likely that the digestive process would break any of this down, but that would start to suggest that perhaps that is not the case. There was also a study done by Chinese scientists where they injected milk-derived mRNA exosomes into the duodenums, that's a piece of the intestine of mice, and then confirmed that it did indeed cross the digestive tract into the blood supply and was active there. Now that did not pass through the stomach acid, so they were planning to do follow-up research where they would feed it to the mice and see if they could get it active in the mouse's bloodstream after it had passed through the entire, the stomach acid as well as not just the duodenum. So that research is not completed yet as far as I know. But there is reason for concern here. The National Science Foundation is also funding research into creating vaccines that are done by taking spinach, lettuce, and other vegetable matter and genetically modifying it to produce mRNA vaccines, and which would then be fed to humans. And if you think this sounds insane, you should know that vaccines being grown in food crops goes back at least 20 years when a company called Protogene was doing this with genetically modified corn. And the next year, the corn came up in the same field. Some of it did, because it hadn't been completely eliminated. And this was now a soybean field. And so the soy was grown, it was harvested, and by the time they realized that it was contaminated with this Protogene, genetic vaccine, they had to destroy 500,000 pounds or was it 500,000 bushels, I think, of soybeans because of this contamination. And the company was fined millions of dollars. You can read about it in the New York Times. It's linked in the piece that I wrote about. And so they're already using food-based vaccines in the animal population and have been for many years now. That suggests to me that it's not impossible for this to be done to humans as well. And so it remains a serious concern for me. I think it's an area that we need to watch carefully. Again, it's one where I would encourage people to go and read the actual research, read papers like mine here, go and read research papers. Dr. Malone has done good work on this. Others have as well. So don't be making statements that are completely unsupported, which will be like crying wolf. And then in 2 to 3 years, when this stuff is active, we will have already discredited ourselves. So don't do that. But do understand this is a real concern. It's probably not far around the corner. And unless we want to be medicated via our food, which to some degree really we are, it's just not with it's not through vaccines in the food. But unless we want to be medicated through our food, we need to start seeking out an independent food supply where we know our own farmer and we know what's going into that food.
Yeah, so there has been some medicalization of food going on for almost my entire life. I grew up in New York City, and to the extent that I grew up, and my recollection is the water was fluoridated, and adding fluorine to the water is a trick to help dental health. Maybe not the biggest concern these days, because I think people are able to manage dental health perfectly fine. We have flossing, we got electric toothbrushes. I think there's a lot more dental care than there maybe was 70 years ago, whatever. I imagine people are still doing this. I imagine water is still fluoridated. There's always vitamin D in milk, and there's all kinds of things.
About the study that came out recently showing from the National Toxicology study. Did you see this?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so it's a study that has now officially confirmed by the United States government that fluoride is a neurotoxin that reduces the IQ of children. They've been attempting to suppress this study for years, and a lawsuit finally forced them to release it. So this was
I don't think there's not much purpose to having it continue. A lot of these things.
There isn't. And if you want to build, if you're concerned about building your enamel, go look up nanohydroxyapatite. It is the actual material out of which your teeth are built. There are
Yeah.
toothpastes you can get that are fluoride free but have nanohydroxyapatite. And I used to use fluoride toothpaste. It never solved my sensitivity. I
Right.
switched to nanohydroxyapatite toothpaste, and guess what? I have no sensitivity anymore. It works. It
That's good.
actually rebuilds your teeth without killing your children's brain
Yeah,
cells,
I mean,
which is
I
a
got to say,
big
I'm
plus.
kind of, I wake up skeptical. I go to sleep skeptical. I'm skeptical during the day. I don't know about when I'm dreaming, but I personally, don't necessarily think you need to do that. I mean, I think the body creates this stuff, and whether you're
Sure.
actually seeking out, I mean, the kind of is there used to be the term that you eat brains, you get smarter. You eat carrots, your vision gets better. I mean, maybe that works to a certain extent for vitamin A, but a lot of things, we kind of have an anthropomorphization of food, and people think if they eat X, there will something will happen. They'll get strong bones. I think your body's perfectly fine as long as you have an adequate amount of essential amino acids, and your diet is adequate for calorically, and you're not being abused in many other ways. You're pretty much going to come out fine. I mean, what's my evidence for that?
But if you
I
are
mean,
but if you are dealing with major health issues,
fair enough.
concentrating
Fair enough.
on
I
very
mean,
careful.
yeah.
I
I
say
mean,
that as somebody who spent 15 years completely disabled from a vaccine injury and had to
oh
put
my
a
God.
ton of effort into rebuilding my health. Yeah, that's why I care about this topic.
No, absolutely. No, I'm totally into caring about things that people care about. My only point is that I think that, there's, if we could go back to say, 1980s or something like that. I mean, food gets processed to a certain point. But if you look at the NBA of the 1980s, you have probably, inner city kids making the majority of the draft class. I mean, now it's a little more international, and kids everywhere probably have more of a refined or observed diet, especially if you're going to be a top draft choice. But if you go back to the halcyon days of my relative youth, 1970s and 80s, people are in these sports, and they're physical, incredible physical specimens, and they're eating junk, what we consider junk food. And I think that you can make a reasonable physical specimen of yourself eating almost anything, as long as there's enough of it and you have the basic minimum of
Yeah,
caloric content.
I don't agree with that at all. But I think that one thing you're missing is that what is in the food supply during the 70s and 80s is not what's in the food supply now.
Yeah, well, that's kind of why I want to listen to you. I mean, we could debate on these things on the margins. I think that a certain amount of processing is something that helps people. I think that the difference between, say, the 70s and 80s or whatever, the better times, is that there wasn't kind of this malfeasance and a kind of a predatory aspect toward the population. I think people had kind of a more genuine sense of wanting the world to be fed. We were told when we were eating food, not to waste, because people, in India, China, are starving, and that was true. They're doing that to a lesser extent, and we should be very, very, very happy about that. That we've been able to kind of generalize food production around the world, and/or transfer of wealth, and people are, the third world, against kind of an old Marxian term, Marxian dialectical term. There was really no. The idea was there was the first world, the second world, based on capitalism versus communism, and everyone else kind of was the third world. So it's kind of taken on a poverty nation thing. But poverty today is much, much different from what it was, say, 60, 70 years ago. That pretty much around the world, people are, there's a lot of poverty. 75% of the world is on the poverty level of what we would consider here, but it's not extreme poverty. It's not starvation poverty, such as it was, say, in the 60s and whatnot. And so I think we've made huge progress, but we're not satisfied with that. Now people want to screw around with it. And again, with vaccines, I think reasonable number of vaccines are okay. I think that probably, tetanus, and, you can argue for, rubella and a couple other things, whatever, but not dozens of them. I think whatever happens, that people just, they start dipping in and overdoing. But we're almost rounding out the hour, and I would like to, take away my megaphone and give it back to you. And but before we do that, I just kind of have one kind of paradoxical question for you. Is that we can be skeptical of additives and whatnot, but earlier on we were talking about farming, and the farmers, let's say in Sri Lanka, they were using inorganic fertilizer and whatnot, as it were. I mean, I think most of it basically has some organic basis to be fertilizer, or else it can't be fertilizer. But however you want to phrase it, wasn't directly from cow manure. It was some processed aspect of
It was
fertilizer.
mostly made
So
from
we want
acid.
farmers to have that. We want them to have basically processed, items. We want them to have mechanical tools and whatnot that's adequate to the task. We don't, in order to get enough food for the people who are here. So we want some processing to happen on the agricultural level, but you're also kind of warning against. I mean, you kind of want to go back to first principles and get kind of the Amish kind of model for farming and whatnot, get our food from that. But that's not really workable worldwide. And I don't think everyone.
What
I
I
don't
well,
think,
so to represent what I think that I want the government to stop making the decisions for the farmers. That's what I really want. If we get rid of our incredibly corrupted model here in this country of agricultural subsidies, we'll get a lot less corn and soybeans, and we'll get a lot more permaculture. Because right now, farmers are paid to grow um, the least nutrient dense crops in existence. And a lot of those are being used for things like ethanol rather than, for food. And there's some of the most glyphosate heavy crops as well. So what I really want is for farmers to be the experts making the decisions, and for there to be a level playing field. Right now, there is no level playing field. In meat production, there's a cartel. In dairy, there's a cartel. In monocropping, there's a massive cartel. If it can be decentralized again so that farmers are incentivized to be able to make their own decisions, and the regulatory structures are not preventing them from processing their own meats and providing it to their neighbors, from raising, eggs, providing it to their own neighbors, we're actually going to have a much cheaper food supply. Because most people don't realize, if you want a meat processing plant, unless you have millions of dollars to drop, you will not be permitted to process your own meat outside of chickens or a very specific statute for sale in state. And so if we allow farmers to do what they do best, and if they want to continue using pesticides, I'm not going to be the one to tell them no. If they want to continue doing heavy processing, I'm not going to be the one to tell them no. But I do not want a system that is slanted in strong regulatory preference to those models, such that the farmers who want to step outside those models are forced to charge artificially high prices for their goods. And that's what we currently have.
I think that's excellent. I think that's kind of the Milton Friedman way of doing things. I think that is a really nice point. I think there's always going to be a marketplace. I mean, we have Whole Foods, and we also have Stop and Shop, and we've got BJ's and Costco and Star Market, whatever. I mean, there's a bunch of different types of things. And then there's these niche markets, and then people can always also order DoorDash, and they can get items, these meal preps, and there's a huge selection of what you can do. I don't pick out your clothing, and you don't pick out my clothing, and I get to wear what I want to wear, and it doesn't really affect or bother anybody else. If I'm I actually had somebody on one of my comments like, "Oh, before I turned the video on, I thought you were British," because I wore a tie. I mean, that's where we are in the United States these days. If you wear a tie, they think you're a foreigner. But whatever. But I like the clothing model. It's like, if we all start wearing the same thing because Chairman Mao said so, then ipso facto it's Maoist. And I think a lot of these things are Maoist. And they have the mix of like Woody Allen's Bananas, lunacy dictator aspect, because I don't think a lot of these things make actual sense. I mean, first of all, their terminology is horrible. As a chemistry major back in the day, when I hear about removing nitrogen from the soil, I'm like, dude, it's not, you're not removing nitrogen. Is like 70% of the atmosphere, and the people who want to like reduce carbon dioxide, they never know how much there is in the atmosphere. They think it's like 5-10% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, and they don't have no idea that obviously in a greenhouse, if you want to grow something, you actually try to have a higher CO2 level, because that makes plants grow. And this little bit of this kind of buffering that happens, if the higher CO2 level, then plants grow better. And so, a lot of it's been going on for a long time before us, and people have this kind of sensibility. They have their own quote unquote DNA of caring, like Dr. Fauci, but it's misguided. You can think you have this, but it doesn't mean you're right. And the way to play these things out is in the marketplace of ideas.
Exactly.
And most of the time, their idea is to shut the bleep up. And
Right.
Fortunately, you're not doing that. I appreciate that. So I'm going to have people, look at your Substack here, and maybe you can, before I have the last word, guide us a little bit about what your plan would be on an individual level and then on a political one.
Sure. So on an individual level, I would encourage people to educate themselves about what is actually in the food supply. There's an interview recently of Casey and Callie Means with Tucker Carlson. If you haven't watched it, I would go watch that to get a 2-hour kind of crash course in what is going on with our food supply. And you can also, obviously, I encourage you to read my article series. They go into more of the nutrition issues. I go into what's happening on a global level. So if you understand those two pieces at the same time, you'll have an excellent idea of what is going on. And the final article is really the most important one in my series, and it's the solutions that I recommend people take. And these are all solutions that you can take on an individual basis. The most important one to me is find a local farmer, get to know them, and buy your food from them, because it's really the only way you can control what you and your family eat. If you're buying things from the grocery store, understand that anything that's an industry standard doesn't have to be listed on the package. So all the meat that you are eating in the grocery store, most of it has been sprayed with what they call citric acid. That citric acid is actually GMO corn fed to a genetically modified black mold that then secretes a substance that they consider to be citric acid because it's chemically similar. It's done in China. They then purify it. They promise you, pinky promise, it's purified, and then it's spread on your meat. And the fact that this happens to go along, the use of this correlates very strongly with the massive rise in black mold allergies. Please pay no attention to the man behind that curtain. So look at my series, look at Casey and Callie's interview to learn more about these issues. But then the solution section goes into a number of other things that you can do. I strongly recommend people support Thomas Massey's Interstate Raw Milk Freedom Act, and that people support the Prime Act. These would go a long way toward allowing our farmers to just do what they do best, which is farm without overt regulatory harassment as is happening at the moment. But yeah, my number one recommendation to people is find a farmer, get to know your farmer, and I provide links where you can find local farms, or if you're in an area that isn't amenable to farming, where you can find farmers who will deliver to your area and will talk to you in depth about what they do and do not do with their food. The other thing I would recommend people remember is, and I say this advisedly as somebody who's spent 15 years of my life completely disabled as the result of an injury from a medical product. Understand that if you are buying extremely cheap food, at some point you probably are going to pay for it with your health. And that when you pay for it with your health, it's not just economic, it's loss of quality of life. I lost 15 years of my youth to this. I lost the time when I should have been concentrating on my education and going out and having friends. I lost all those years. And the reason I'm back to where I am now is because of embracing healthy food, raw milk, meat that was not overly processed, and I was able to rebuild my health from a point where I could basically not get out of bed and my heart stopped every time I stood up. So I'm evidence of what can happen when you concentrate on prioritizing your health through what you eat. And I encourage other people to consider doing the same. You might be amazed at the transformation you see.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy. So people can find you on Twitter. I have your Substack up, and I'm so happy that you have achieved so many of your personal goals, and that you're applying your very interesting, thorough research and lens and capabilities to helping guide others. So thank you for that. I think that there is kind of us versus them aspect, and the little guy is the little guy in this case, and we have to kind of stick together. Or what is the expression? Something I can't get it quite right.
Hang together, or we'll all hang
thank
separately.
You. Either we hang together or we're all hang separately. And I think a lot of people would think that would be a net benefit. I mean, we've seen the French Revolution where they were solving so many problems by hanging people or guillotining them. It was actually, I think, Guillot was a physician, if I'm not mistaken, and he helped perfect the guillotine named after him. And maybe Dr. Fauci can look into that kind of thing, because it is actually a way of removing carbon using individuals. So before we leave, I would like to make a quick plug for myself. It has some coincident themes, but I'll leave it for people to decide. If you want to help support my podcast, you can go buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika. It's fascinating. I mean, it's something I had never planned on writing about. I went through medical school. We never heard of Zika, barely heard of microcephaly. And all of a sudden, Zika is a dengue virus, and it's probably a real virus. There are 4 dengue viruses, and the 5th one is called Zika. It's not a human problem, as are the other 4 dengues, which are endemic to Brazil and whatnot. And all of a sudden, for reasons that had a lot to do with personal personal interest and self-aggrandizement career path. They decided there was Zika there when it's really there was not a single Zika test available in humanity, because Zika never caused a single human illness. And then they, in my view, misattributed some slight cases of microcephaly. There were normally 7 at any moment in the hospital wards in Recife, and there were probably about 13 or 15, and they decided that was an epidemic when it wasn't. It was probably just a statistical aberration. And they said, oh, that one thing's new, Zika's new, and microcephaly is new, one must be causing the other. It went through no peer review studies, and it took over the world in a sense. It became a pandemic or a public health emergency of international concern, the Rio Olympics, a lot of stuff. And anyway, it was the biggest pandemic to its point affecting global interests. And people were told not to have kids throughout the Central America, tropics and whatnot, until there was a Zika vaccine. There hasn't been one. There would be no children at all if anyone had listened. Anyway, it's a fascinating tiptoe through the tulips of the same, actors, WHO and Dr. Fauci and one who come along, acting mostly as if they're in their self-interest, their own self-interest. Bill Gates actually doesn't make it into the book, but I read later in 2017, he offered $100 million to Moderna to make an mRNA Zika vaccine, as long as they would make it in the mRNA modality. So I think a lot of the technocratic aspects are the same, that people, first of all, it has to do with reducing population. They told people to stop having kids. It became such a big thing in Brazil because they wanted to overturn the abortion constraints in Latin America. So there was they went judicially to the Supreme Court in Brazil, and we've seen what the Supreme Court in Brazil is like now. And it didn't get overturned, but they were kind of happy. The left was happy that there was this Zika microcephaly issue potentially, because they could, order emergency abortion. So between euthanasia and abortion, it's like, and population reduction, don't have kids. It seems always the same prescription, no matter what the emergency is. I think would be my segue or my connection to what you're talking about. And you have to kind of, it has to be caveat lector, caveat emptor. We have to be careful what crap we're buying. Crap can be really useful in the garden. I grow my plants by putting a fair amount of manure in it, but you don't want to eat it. You don't want to consume it mentally. So I really appreciate your, excellent articles and research perspective. People can find you on Brownstone as well. And I'm happy to have you, that Brownstone saw fit to have you there. And I look forward to reading more.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
All right, perfect. Nice to see you as well. And thank you. We'll hope to have you on again.
Sounds good.